Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. In 1993, Guillermo del Toro made his first feature film, Cronos. I covered that movie some time ago on this show, and after turning some heads with that lower budget and different take on vampires, the then 33-year-old Mexican filmmaker was given a $30 million budget to direct the movie that will be the topic of this week's Monster Mondays, Mimic. However, 1997 would end up becoming a very pivotal and yet unfortunate year for Del Toro. First, let's talk about the personal side of things. Just after the making of 1993's Cronos, Del Toro met and eventually became very close friends with one of the absolutely most powerful filmmakers in all of Hollywood, James Cameron. I bring this up because his name will be mentioned a couple of more times here over the course of the discussion of the year 1997 and the movie Mimic. At some point around 1997, Guillermo's father, Federico del Toro Torres, was kidnapped. He was in Guadalajara at the time of the kidnapping. Now, here's the first time I'll bring James Cameron up again. Cameron, once he found out about the kidnapping, immediately went to his friend's aid and offered to help Guillermo pay for a negotiator. Del Toro would accept the offer, and Del Toro's family ended up having to pay the kidnappers twice the ransom originally asked for, but Federico was released and returned to his family after being gone for 72 days. Shortly after getting his father back, Guillermo, his parents, and his siblings decided to move out of Mexico. This is something that would stick with him because he is constantly reminded of what happened and the decisions that had to be made afterwards, and he calls himself an involuntary exile from his beloved country. While he had to deal with that in 1997, he also had to deal with a fairly unhappy situation at work, too. Despite being nominally liked as a whole by critics, Del Toro didn't like the end result of Mimic. He was not allowed to have final cut rights on the film, so he ended up just being almost a work-for-hire type of situation here. On top of that, Del Toro and Miramax, the production studio in charge of Mimic, the co-founder, Harvey Weinstein, I wonder what that guy's been up to these last few years. But anyway, Weinstein and Del Toro did not get along. After seeing some early footage, Weinstein said the movie wasn't scary enough and demanded that Del Toro correct the tone of the movie. That led even to Weinstein being so mad at Del Toro over what he was getting back from the Mexican filmmaker that Weinstein himself stormed onto the set in Toronto and attempted to teach Del Toro, quote, how to make a movie, unquote. Weinstein eventually tried to get Del Toro fired. However, lead actress Mira Sorvino convinced him otherwise. I'm going to guess that this was Sorvino being hot at the time after just recently winning Best Supporting Actress the year before. However, she was probably the one who this movie was going to be the one that everything was going to be sold on. However, I should bring up that Sorvino also had her issues with Harvey Weinstein. Surprise, surprise, as she felt that rejecting Weinstein's kind of gross advances towards her, as he did with many of the actresses that came through Miramax films, ultimately led to her career being stifled a little bit, but with the backlash from that. It's even said that that she was not allowed to be approached, nor was Ashley Judd for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because of her and Judd basically rejecting Weinstein. The whole thing is awful. The man is just a nasty person and a sex pest, and apparently that didn't just go towards actresses. It also went toward filmmakers like Del Toro and others who went through the system at that time. But the entire mood of the production of Mimic was not enjoyable for most of the cast and crew, and that is entirely on the behavior of Harvey Weinstein. Once the movie was finished and the cut that Weinstein wanted was released, the movie would fall short of making back its production budget of $30 million. However, the film did get some decent reviews. In fact, Siskel and Ebert were both fairly complimentary of it when they reviewed it for their program. Ebert would call out the visual style that Del Toro has and how impressive the young filmmaker was in that regard. And of course, that's only grown more and more throughout Del Toro's career. However, audiences were not as impressed. But here's the second time that James Cameron enters the story. After Cameron's big night at the Oscars on March 23rd, 1998, Cameron had a run-in with Harvey Weinstein, and knowing the story about how Del Toro was treated during the production of Mimic, Cameron told Weinstein what he thought, and the two nearly came to blows. In an interview with Vanity Fair commemorating the big night that Cameron's Titanic had by winning 11 Oscars, Cameron was asked what he remembered from that night, and he said that he almost hit Weinstein with his Oscar. He basically remembers telling Weinstein that despite the producer and mogul thinking how much of a favor Miramax did for Del Toro, that Cameron felt Miramax did no favors to any true artist and left it at that. And I guess some people had to tell the two of them to save it for later, as it was nearly time for people to get back to their seats for the broadcast. In 2010, Del Toro was finally able to take a shot at recutting Mimic. He does admit that the final product still was not the film he ultimately wanted to do, but it did heal some of the wounds from the original production. That said, he is finally happy with the cut that he was able to assemble, and it is now the widely available version of the film on Blu-ray and digital services. And it's also the cut that I'll be watching for this episode of Monster Mondays. So the movie takes place in New York City, and as the credits roll, we learn that children are getting sick and dying from a new infection called Strickler's disease that is being spread by cockroaches. As the death toll rises to almost uncontrollable numbers over the past 2 years, the deputy director of the CDC, Dr. Peter Mann, played by Jeremy Northam, enlists Dr. Susan Tyler, played by Mira Sorvino, who is an entomologist, to try to figure out how to rid the city of the infected roaches. He explains that most children who are infected with Strickler's disease will die. Those who somehow survive it will live life probably in leg braces and have physical development issues. Dr. Tyler gets to work quickly, and she genetically breeds a hybrid called Judas that combines a mantis and termites. What the Judas bug does is release an enzyme, and this enzyme, when ingested by the cockroach, will accelerate the metabolism. That then makes it impossible for the roaches to eat enough to maintain the calories they burn. And it basically starves the cockroaches to death. And after 6 months, Strickler's is all but defeated. No new cases of the disease is reported, and Doctors Mann and Tyler get married. However, 3 years later, not all is as well as originally thought. Sure, there are kids around now, and at least more, than there would have been with Strickler's disease still running rampant, but there are strange deaths occurring. We see a priest chased to the roof of his mission, and a bizarre attacker makes the man fall to his death, and then that attacker then drags the man into the underground by something that makes sounds like a chittering sound. Across the street, a boy named Chewy witnesses the priest being taken away, but doesn't quite connect anything odd about what happened because he has a form of autism that gives him a mental pattern of constantly trying to copy sounds. So he hears the chittering of the attackers and is able to perfectly copy the sound with a pair of spoons. He also spots the attacker had quote-unquote funny shoes and names him Mr. Funny Shoes, and it clearly makes the attacker seem a little less than human. The preacher who was running that church was basically covering for the Chinese mafia and a slave labor racket that was going on in the basement of the church. But how Dr. Mann and Josh Maslow, played by Josh Brolin, come into this from the CDC perspective is that due to the trapped slave labor, they were called in to investigate about the potential of various diseases and stuff being passed around between the people who were working in the basement. They hear things from one of the laborers about quote unquote dark angels that come and take some people away. Elsewhere, a couple of kids who basically become curious in entomology come to visit Dr. Tyler. They have found a really strange bug in the subway that happens to still be alive. Outside her office, that dark attacker from earlier that drugged the preacher away is watching from the street. Now, the bug that they have brought to her is a large cockroach-like creature, but it seems to be something of a young version of this bug. She calls it a baby. It also has a way to latch onto her hand with some really sharp and powerful legs. When she impales it with the usual pins that entomologists use to mount bugs, it secretes something very familiar, that foamy enzyme that wiped out the infected cockroaches. So the Judas bugs were not supposed to live longer than 6 months. They were supposed to wipe out the cockroaches, and they were infertile, so they should have died within whatever the normal time span is. But while she goes over her research, Mr. Funny Shoes sneaks into her office and takes the specimen that she was looking at. Doctors Mann and Tyler then investigate where the kids found the weird bug in the subway, and she's specifically looking for an egg casing. But as they look around, they hear the clicking of bug wings and discover that there are all sorts of more passages under the room that they were poking around in. In New York City, basically the subways are kind of built on top of each other. So as a new subway is built, it is kind of built on top of an older subway. So there's all sorts of passageways underground. Now, the kids who basically found the bug earlier, they are now looking for an egg sac and plan to grab, the one that they find stuck to the wall of the subway and sell it to Dr. Tyler. But they are attacked and ultimately killed by, quote unquote, Mr. Funny Shoes, which really is just kind of a tall mantis-like being that walks on two legs. But that night, Chewie follows the sound of more chittering of those bug people to the condemned mission across the street where the preacher was and where the slave labor people were in the basement. He discovers that there isn't one Mr. Funny Shoes, but two bugs. Now, Chewie isn't the only one learning more and more about the surviving Judas bugs. At the sanitation plant, a large bug creature was fished out of the sewage that Dr. Tyler's mentor, Dr. Gates, played by F. Murray Abraham, begins an autopsy on. The bug found in the sewer had fully formed and functional lungs, which means that these bugs can grow to be quite large. That's why bugs don't have lungs or don't get very big, is that their breathing apparatus, because they don't have lungs, prevent them from growing to whatever size would suit them. And he discovers that this was basically an army bug that would be part of a colony. It would not have become this way on its own in a vacuum. And it turns out that there is a colony thriving under the subway system in New York City. Now, Dr. Tyler is learning this too as she tries asking someone in the subway for the time, but it turns out to be Mr. Funny Shoes, who has disguised himself as a person in a trench coat. It unfolds itself into a flying mantid and abducts her and flies down the subway tunnel. When Dr. Tyler wakes up, she's been taken to the Judas colony. So now we have Dr. Mann and Officer Norton, who is helping Dr. Mann investigate the subways, stuck deep in the system without a way to get up and out, so they have to send Josh to go get help. We also have Dr. Tyler in the colony. Manny, who is Chewie's father, is also poking around in the sewers looking for his missing kid. And yes, Chewie is still missing. Manny is able to find where Dr. Tyler is by seeing her through a grate on the surface or on the level above her. So he finds Norton and Dr. Mann, who help to pull her out to their level. But Josh is elsewhere, killed by some of the Judas bugs just as he was about to get back to the surface, where he would have been able to get more help for the others down below. After Dr. Mann, Norton, and Manny save Dr. Tyler, they are chased by a bug and barricade themselves in an old subway car. Now, more of the bugs are called to them when Manny and Officer Norton begin yelling at Dr. Tyler for creating something that could have evolved the way these bugs are, which has led to Norton being hurt and Chewie being missing. When the bugs come, they smell the blood from Norton's wound, and Dr. Tyler acts quickly to use some of the dead bug that they killed when barricading themselves to basically use some of the goo from its innards to cover the scent of the blood and basically allow them to have some limited ability to operate within the colony. Now, Manny goes out with Dr. Mann to attempt to activate the line that the car is on to get them to safety. And Manny ends up locating Chewie, who has managed to survive because of his ability to perfectly mimic the sounds that these bugs make. However, this does get Manny killed. Dr. Tyler believes that the bugs' plan are to use the subway system to spread out into the city, but in order for that to be stopped, they have to find what she believes will be a lone fertile male in the colony and to kill it so that the bugs will die in a single generation. By the way, spoilers, I don't know how much that really works in the long run because there are a couple of sequels to this movie, but I digress. Now, Dr. Tyler does find Chewie and discovers that Manny has been killed. But Dr. Mann succeeds in getting power back to the subway car so it can begin rolling, but it doesn't have enough to get all the way out. Dr. Mann instead now discovers a dumbwaiter that they can use to get out, but Norton can't stop the bleeding from his wound, so he knows that he's basically going to be a goner once the bugs smell the blood coming from his leg. So he sacrifices himself to buy time for the other three to get out. And Dr. Tyler and Chewie go up the dumbwaiter while Dr. Mann decides to destroy the nest. He does indeed blow up the nest using basically a leaky gas line and a lighter to explode the entire subway system. But the male escapes the inferno. When the male tries to go after Chewie, Dr. Tyler is able to lure him into the path of a train. She and Chewie come to the surface where she sees a figure who she worries might be another bug male, but it turns out to be Dr. Mann, who did survive the blast and reunites with his wife and the little boy Chewie. For the three things about Mimic that I like, I want to start with something I talk about on occasion on the Film Seizure show. This is 1997 New York City, and it's in the waning days of the grimy, gritty look that New York was always kind of known for. Setting a movie about bugs in a city that still looks old and has a dangerous persona about it is kind of great. The movie is dark, and that grime and grit makes this a sadly recognizable experience. There isn't a pretty gloss spread over this to make it, look and feel like a typical movie. Guillermo del Toro gets better after this movie at combining the sheen of a fantasy that movies are with a gritty realism and danger that tells you that there is no real safety for any one character within the movie. However, here, while he mostly stays in that dark and shadowy dirt of the New York landscape, there is still a wonderful amount of visual style that makes almost every shot of this movie engrossing. Second, I do like the human element of this movie. This is something that Del Toro has always been really good at. It's not just the CDC people and the Charles S. Dutton cop character chasing down monster bugs. You have Dr. Tyler and Dr. Mann trying to conceive a baby. This mirrors kind of the whole reason why these two get together in the first place. They met over a need to figure out a way to save the lives of children who, are in danger of being afflicted by Strickler's disease. Now, 3 years later, they're trying to have a baby themselves. Northam and Servino are really good together in this. They do have some scenes that give them a considerable amount of chemistry. You then have a child character of Chewie, and he was, probably spared from Strickler's because his father kept him home from school because of his autism. Del Toro is always good at putting child characters in a certain amount of peril in his movies, and in this case, Chewie disappears from the movie for a while, and you are terrified that he's dead. The last time you saw him, he's surrounded by two of the giant bug people. So you do care about what's going on with him. And Giancarlo Giannini playing Chewie's dad is great too, even if Del Toro wanted to cast his Kronos lead, Federico Lupi, in the role originally. But all around, this is a good cast that you do ultimately care a lot about. Really the only character that you don't get a whole lot of impressionable, care for is the Josh Brolin character, because he is kind of a hot shot and he is kind of he's very flippant towards a lot of things as he works in the CDC. So, the only thing that makes it unfortunate that he doesn't survive is how close he was to getting out to get help. Otherwise, he's really the only character that you don't have a great deal of palpable care and reason to make sure that they don't get hurt in the long run of the main cast. So that's a really great thing about this movie, is that you do end up caring about what's going on with the people, and they're just not fodder for these bugs to eat. Thirdly, at the halfway point of this movie, there's a brilliant reveal of what the bugs are and what the meaning of the title is. Dr. Mann, Dutton's Officer Norton, and Josh are under the subway investigating where the bugs are. Dr. Tyler is in the subway station's platform up above. There, she looks through the Polaroid pictures she took of the specimen fished out of the sewer. Something catches her eye in two of the pictures. As she pieces the two pictures together, she discovers that the bugs can form a human-like face. It is entirely silent as she sees this eerie, inhuman face in the Polaroids, and then all of a sudden that's broken when a train arrives, providing this nice little jump scare with this kind of squealing noise that almost sounds like a monster itself. Then she notices that most of the passengers of the subway are leaving the station because it's going to be closed down for a little while, which was announced over the intercom that there was going to be a closure in 5 minutes. So there's no new foot traffic coming into the subway platform. It's just people leaving the platform. She wants to find out what time it is because she's expecting Dr. Mann to meet her there. And that's when she asks Mr. Funny Shoes, who she mistakes as a person in a trench coat. It then shows her how it mimics its prey by splitting its fake, almost person-like face to reveal its bug face and unfolds its supposed trench coat into wings. It's a great moment. Sure, it's a little ruined by some poorly placed slow motion, but the reveal and the realization that this is how the bugs can move through the city, mostly unnoticed, is well done and uses a lot of really good techniques. And if you think, well, wouldn't somebody notice that there's somebody that's obviously not a person, but a bug? Well, if you're just kind of passing somebody on the street, or if you're not really like trying to make perfect eye contact with somebody that you are engaging with, it could actually potentially work, especially if you are kind of just assuming that you're seeing a person in a trench coat. It kind of works. I mean, it's the same thing that's used throughout nature as far as mimicry and hiding amongst its own predators that a lot of animals, particularly in the insect world, will use. And it's revealed very well in this movie. And it's very eerie when she puts the two pictures together and you realize, oh, there's a human face there now. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next time, we uncover a 25-year secret invasion as a small town in the Midwest is revealed to be a hotbed of alien activity in the 1983 sci-fi homage throwback, Strange Invaders. Until next week, stay spooky.